folks, today I'll be talking about GraphQL customizations for databases and naming conventions. Like Jesse mentioned, we had demoed the server and that's the API side of it in the past community calls. But today we have added, recently we've added support for the console side of things. So I would just like to revisit the feature and take you over how it looks like, you interacting with the feature using the console. With that, I'm just going to dive into the demo. And right, so as we folks can see, I have a Hasura instance running here, and I have a database called PG1 connected with a simple author and article schema in it. So if we head over to the API tab, you can see that you have articles and authors as your fields that are being exposed. So what I'm going to do is try to connect a new database. What I'm doing actually is just connecting the same database, but again, the reasoning I'll probably explain in a second, but I'm going to call it PG2, and I'm going to go ahead and try to type it out without making typos. Right, that looks good. And connect. So as you see, I managed to connect my database PG2. And if I head over to the public schema, you can see that I have the article and other tables here again. So what I'm going to try to do is go and track this particular tables that we have in this data source. And as you would imagine, we see an error here. The reasoning for this error is pretty obvious. We already have author and article tables that have been created in the PG, that were part of the PG1 database, and they're already exposed over the GraphQL API. And us trying to track another table with author and article is going to lead to a conflict. So what we could do now instead is we have the ability to customize the GraphQL fields that are generated off a database. So if I head over to the edit of the edit section of the database, and we see the section where we can have GraphQL field level customizations. So I'm just going to go ahead and set a bunch of values here, and I'll explain what each of them does. So as you see here, we have the first section here is the naming conventions. By default, the Hasura default is what's being chosen, but for the purpose of the demo, I'm going to choose the GraphQL default, which changes the naming conventions from your snake case to a camel case style naming convention, which is useful in certain languages. What else I'm going to do is I'm going to add this data source with I'm going to add a namespace for this particular data space, for the database, and I'm going to call it NS. I'm going to add a prefix and suffix. So root pre, root suff, and just going to add a bunch of values here, and we will soon see what the impact of these values are. There we go. I'm just going to add these values, and I'm going to update the connection. So now if I head back to my public schema and I try to track all the tables, you see it kind of goes through and there are no more conflicts anymore. I'm going to go ahead and track all the relationships as well. So now if I head back to the API tab, what you can see is we have this new field got added to the top, which is called NS. So this is the namespace we just created. And you can see all the fields that were part of this database are now under this NS namespace. What we also see is this root pre and the root suffix that have been added to each field type that was generated. So as you would see here, the typical thing would have been called just article, but now we have root pre, article, and root suffix added to that just because I defined a prefix and suffix for the field types. Also, if I head a little deeper and if you would see the types of, if you see the types that are being created for this particular database, we would be able to see that all the types of this particular database have the type pre and the type suff kind of added to that. So we've been able to add a prefix and a suffix to the types and a prefix and a suffix to the field names as well. Also, what we noticed is because of the naming convention I said, you would notice that all the fields that have been created are in camel case as opposed to snake case, which is the default. Like you see here, we have article by PK, but when I use the GraphQL default naming convention, we end up with article by PK, but in camel case. So that's the feature in a sense. Basically, whenever you connect a database, you have more flexibility on what the actual GraphQL API that gets generated, and that has many use cases. That's basically what my demo was. We have very similar functionality for remote schemas as well, where a remote schema is an external GraphQL API that you connect to Hasura, and you can do pretty much very similar stuff with remote schemas as well. So so as we kind of saw, the Hasura kind of lets you to add GraphQL fields for a particular database under a particular namespace. It also lets you customize the auto-generated field and type names generated for your database objects. And the typical use cases that would help, I mean, this feature would help out is if you would have lots of databases that you're adding and connecting to Hasura, this could help you identify which fields and which types are coming from which particular database. It also helps you group all the fields and fields that have been generated by a particular database. Like for example, we added all the fields of PG2 under the NS namespace. And of course, we can always resolve conflicts with existing GraphQL objects. So in situations where we have two data sources which have objects with the same name, this helps you, modify the types and the field names, so you can expose both of them. For the naming conventions as well, like I said, the most typical use case, it's mostly an aesthetic thing to have an API in a certain casing, and it's really useful for people who are consuming the API through languages like JavaScript, and JavaScript uses the camel casing as its default style. So all the types which get generated on the API calls that you make would also be in camel casing, which fits really well with the JavaScript ecosystem. So yeah, that was the feature, and thank you.